It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we get our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Amick year 1776. In the midst of political turmoil and profound economic changes in Europe, a book was born called The W of Nations. It is not only an economic work but also a spiritual map that opens the way to a new era where the division of labor, free trade and individual interests become the underlying currents shaping modern society, from seemingly simple observations such as the scene of a pinsmith dividing up the stages. Adam Smith painted a comprehensive picture of how nations build wealth and power. But the core question the book leaves behind still resonates today. Does true prosperity spring from individual selfishness or from a deeper order whose roots we have never touched? And as we look back at the 21st century global economy, do we still recognize Adam Smith's guiding light, or have we lost our way in a maze of policies, vested interests, and inequality? And before going into this summary, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully appreciate its content. Because only when you read this book will you understand the issues I am talking about. Please buy the book and support the author. Now let me start summarizing this book. Volume 1: The Causes of Improved Productivity of Labor and of the Natural Order of Distribution of the Products of Society Among the Different Classes. A rich nation is not made up of gold in vaults or spoils from wars. Its prosperity comes from human hands and minds, from labor, from the ability to organize and divide work. Every year people create a huge stockpile of necessities and amenities for living. If we know how to distribute and exchange, society will not only have enough food and clothing, but even the poorest worker can live more comfortably than a wilderness chief. But what makes labor productive? The answer lies in the division of labor. Imagine a small pin factory. If a single person were to pull the wire, cut, grind, polish, and package it, it might take him a whole day to make a few, or even not one. Yet when the job was divided into nearly 20 small operations, 10 workers in a poor workshop could still produce more than 48,000 pins a day each, instead of just a few, now producing thousands. The difference is overwhelming. 3 secrets behind this phenomenon are clear. First, when concentrating on a task, the hand becomes so proficient that it can work incredibly quickly and skillfully. Second, they no longer waste time switching from one task to another, no longer plowing the fields, spinning, and mending clothes at the same time, leading to slow aging. And third, from repetition, man created tools and then machines. The steam engine once needed a boy to keep the valve open. It was a lazy boy who finally invented the way to tie a string so that the valve would open and close automatically. Free your hands to run and play. Those simple inventions were the foundation for an entire industrial revolution. And it is also thanks to the division of labor that wealth spreads to the farmers plowing the fields. The weaver weaves cloth, the blacksmith forges knives, the sailor carries cargo across the ocean, each creates more than he needs. Then take the surplus to exchange. The seemingly simple rough cloth shirt of the worker is actually the result of dozens of hands, from the sheep herder, the wool spreader, the dyer, and the weaver. The dye carrier from across the ocean. An ordinary item to cover the body is the crystallization of the efforts of thousands of people. But why are people willing to trade? Not out of kindness. Our daily bread does not come from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer. But from their own personal interests, they want to sell for profit. We buy to satisfy our needs. It is self-interest at stake that creates cooperation. No one can rely solely on compassion. Even beggars exchange their pleas for a few coins, which they then use to buy bread, change clothes, and rent a place to sleep. And so a deep division of labor is formed. The skilled bowmaker would specialize in making weapons, in exchange for meat from hunters. Others who were good at building tents would become carpenters of the tribe, in exchange for animal skins and food. The difference in profession gradually deepens in human talent. It seems to be a gift from God. In fact, most of it is formed from that habit of exchange and division of labor. But the division of labor cannot develop indefinitely. It has a natural limit, market size. Only when there are enough buyers, enough demand. The new worker concentrates on one job. In a remote village in the Scottish Highlands, no one could make a living by hammering nails all their lives because the whole area could not consume a single day's production. Therefore, division of labor flourished most strongly in cities, in bustling commercial areas and especially in riverside and coastal areas, where trade was bustling. A train journey from London to Edinburgh took 6 weeks, requiring hundreds of men and 400 horses to carry 4 tons of goods. Meanwhile, a small ship with a few sailors can carry 200 tons in the same time, just by water. Transportation costs are reduced dozens of times, expanding the market and making goods circulate. Therefore, early civilizations such as Egypt with the Nile River, India with the Ganges River, China with its great rivers or the cities around the Mediterranean, all relied on water transportation to thrive. And then when the assignment took shape a new problem arose. Direct exchange of goods is too troublesome. The butcher has meat, the brewer has beer, the baker has bread. If the baker had enough today, he wouldn't need any more meat. And if the butcher is not thirsty for beer, the deal will be deadlocked. From that inconvenience, humans searched for an intermediary that everyone accepted. At first it could be cattle, salt, shells, tobacco, animal skins, depending on the land, but eventually metal, which is durable, easy to divide and recombine, was gradually chosen. The government stamps copper bars, silver bars, and gold bars to ensure weight and purity. Thus money was born and society entered a new era. People become traders in the broad sense. Live by exchange, buying and selling, pricing. When money appeared, all exchanges became flexible. Instead of exchanging meat for bread, bread for beer. People use silver, copper, gold as intermediaries. But using crude metals also has its disadvantages. Every purchase and sale must be weighed and tested for quality, and many crooks mix cheap copper into fake silver bars to end this inconvenience. Countries created coins with seals of their sovereigns. The mark certifies that the coin is of sufficient weight and purity. From there, exchanges were quick, trade confidence was established, and the economy ran smoothly. Money is not only a medium of exchange, it also paved the way for the concepts of price, use value, and exchange value. Water is incredibly useful but almost priceless on the market. In contrast, diamonds are almost useless in everyday life but can be exchanged for countless other goods. From that paradox, he delved into the true nature of price. An item. According to him, there are 2 kinds of prices, real price and nominal price. Real price is the amount of labor required to produce it. Nominal price is the amount of money it is sold for in the market. For example, a piece of cloth might sell for 10 silver coins, but the real cost of creating it is the effort of the shepherd, the spinner, the weaver, the dyer, all the labor that went into it from start to finish. Labor thus becomes the ultimate measure. How much a good is worth is how much other labor it allows you to buy. 10 silver coins is just a temporary expression. It is essentially the right to use the labor of others in society. This was a revolutionary perspective because it took value out of gold, silver, and diamonds and laid the foundation for the later labor theory of value. But the price of commodities does not only reflect labor, it is also made up of 3 parts: wages, profit and rent. Workers need to be paid to live and work. Capitalists must make a profit to continue doing business. Land, a limited resource, generates a special income called rent, which flows to the landlord. Any product from a loaf of bread to a shirt is divided into 3 such parts. The difference between natural price and market price. Natural price is the level the product needs to reach to pay off all 3 bills. Fair wages, reasonable profits, just rent. Market prices fluctuate depending on supply and demand. If the market is scarce, prices skyrocket; if there is a surplus, prices fall dramatically. But over time, prices tend to return closer to their natural prices. Like a pendulum swinging around an equilibrium point. Here the story takes us deeper into the participants in the production chain. First is the worker. They only have hands, so their only source of income is wages. This salary is under great pressure. When there is a surplus of labor, wages are forced down to the bare minimum needed to sustain life. But if there is a shortage of labor, wages increase, even making bosses afraid because of rising costs. This contraction is continuous, and in society, workers are often in a weaker position, forced to accept the lowest level to survive. Next is the return on capital. Whenever a person uses capital to hire labor, buy raw materials, open a factory, he expects to get more in return than he put in. The difference is profit. It fluctuates depending on the level of competition and risk. When capital is scarce, profits are high. When capital is abundant and competition is fierce, profits decrease. This is the rhythm of the economy. And finally, ground rent, the special income from land. If the land is fertile, the cultivator is willing to pay high rent to use it. If the land is bad, the land rent is reduced or even zero. Therefore, it is both a source of livelihood and a tool for profiteering of the landlord class. The final product distribution always passes through three doors: to the worker as wages, to the capitalist as profit, and to the landlord as rent. But why is the salary different for the same job? Some professions have a disparity in themselves. Dangerous and arduous jobs often pay more to compensate. The profession requires many years of study and also requires high wages. Easy, popular, and competitive jobs have low salaries. In addition, European government policies at that time also created regulatory injustice, monopolies. Guild privileges protected many trades. Wages and profits are distorted. If wages and profits are the two main streams in price, then rent is the underground but persistent stream that flows through every piece of land to understand it. There is a type of land that no matter what you sow, it will yield an abundant harvest. There are barren lands that never yield much. That difference makes farmers pay different prices for the right to farm. Rent is therefore not a reward for labor. Not for capital but for the monopoly of land ownership. I distinguish three types of earth products. The first type, land that is always profitable like fertile rice fields and rich lands, certainly creates rent. Second type, land is sometimes profitable, sometimes not, depending on the season, depending on the market. And the third kind, products which rarely yield rent because they are either too abundant or of low value. Fluctuations in each type directly affect the lives of farmers, landlords, and society as a whole. I also stopped for a while to talk about silver. The metal that rocked Europe for centuries, the value of silver fluctuated constantly. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it falls miserably. Due to new mine discoveries in America or trade flows, whenever the price of silver fell, all commodity prices and incomes of all classes fluctuated. The seemingly distant turmoil in the South American silver mines seeps into every meal. The roof shirt in Europe. Social progress not only changes the value of silver or gold but also changes the nature of all kinds of products. The three primary products of cereals, meat, milk, and wood were all affected differently as society developed. Grain has become cheaper due to improved farming. Meat and milk are getting more expensive. Because the land for livestock is gradually encroached by plowed fields. Wood, once inexhaustible, became scarce as populations grew. The forest was exhausted. These changes skewed the balance between classes, and landlord rents varied in directions that even they sometimes did not anticipate. Commonwealth lies not only in who gets how much but in how the entire product of labor is distributed. A progressive society needs a balance between workers, capitalists and landlords. If one side is pushed to the brink of collapse, the machine will break. But history shows that the balance often tilts in favor of those with power and wealth. Landlords enjoy rent without working. Capitalists make profits from capital. Workers bear the brunt as their wages are forced to the bare minimum required for survival. Seen from above, the whole picture reveals itself as one giant mechanism, with division of labor creating productivity, exchange paving the way for markets, and money acting as the glue. And then the final product is divided into three parts: wages, land rent, all the ups and downs of the national economy, all the joys and sorrows of each individual fate are closely tied to that mechanism. As I write these pages, I know that I am suggesting a different way of looking at wealth. It is not in the king's treasury, nor in the amount of gold and silver treasures stored in the vaults, but in our own labor and the way we organize. Distribute the fruits of that labor. When discussing workers' salaries, I do not just stop at the numbers but also look into the essence. The minimum wage in reality is the fragile line between life and death. If pushed down further, workers would not be able to support themselves and their families. Society would collapse, so there is a natural limit, but it is not always respected. The capitalists, with their capital advantage, often unite to keep wages low, while the poor, scattered workers rarely have a chance to bargain. That inequality makes the labor market the most stressful place, where power is never evenly distributed. As the economy expands, demand for labor increases, wages may rise above the minimum, offering some hope. But even then, workers are always in a precarious situation, because any downturn pushes them back to square one. This shift between hope and despair is the heartbeat of working life. What about capital gains? Its essence is the surplus that the investor retains after paying the labor. Profits fluctuate and they tend to decrease as society develops. Competition erodes profit margins, forcing many to accept less to stay relevant. But paradoxically, falling profits do not mean that the capital class is dirty too. On the contrary, when the scale of production expands, the margins are thinner but the total profits are larger. And they continue to expand their land rent power. The last piece is different. It is not a reward for risk, nor is it compensation for labor. It is purely a payment for scarcity and exclusivity. If a fertile field next to a river is easy to transport goods, it will generate high rent, but a dry, remote plot of land will generate almost none. The very existence of land rent is proof that society has never operated on a basis of absolute equality. There are times when silver is so cheap that the price of goods skyrocket, and there are times when silver is so rare that everything becomes expensive. Those 400 years of change were not only about mines in the New World, but also about bread in Paris, wool in London, and timber in Hamburg. The vibration of a metal has crept into every meal, every home of the people. Why are some commodities hit harder? Grains, a staple product, are generally more stable in price due to constant demand. But meat, milk, and wood fluctuate wildly because they depend on soil, climate, and population density. As the population grew and farmland encroached on pasture, meat became a luxury. When forests were cut down, wood became a commodity more precious than gold in the cold winter. The progress we often celebrate never distributes its benefits equitably. There are people who enjoy more than they contribute, simply because they own land or have capital. As for the direct workers, the left hands often receive the least. But even so, they are the measure of value, the foundation of all possessions. The economy is neither a game for kings nor a gift from the gods. It is the result of labor, of exchange, of very human, sometimes cruel but undeniable laws in every society. The final product is always divided into three parts: wages for the worker, profit for the capitalist, and rent for the landlord. That division is not static. It moves, expands, and is affected by countless factors from seasons, trade to sometimes unreasonable government policies. If wages increase, profits may decrease. If rents rise, both wages and profits may be squeezed. It is a perpetual tug-of-war, a delicate balancing act of economic life. Amid these disparities, the policies of European countries have given rise to further discontent. Restrictive regulations and privileges given to certain professions distort the natural division of labor. In many places, workers were forced into guilds, subject to all sorts of fees and restrictions. And the big business gets monopolies which they easily turn into vest tools. These artificial walls not only distort prices but also further skew the distribution of wealth. But beyond policy there is also a natural principle of commodity prices. No matter how it fluctuates, it still revolves around its natural price. Market prices can skyrocket when there is a shortage or fall dramatically when there is an excess supply. But over time, it will return to around the level that salary, profit and rent can be maintained. It is like a compass that always points to north. Though the needle shakes violently in the storm, in the final chapters attention is paid to land, a basic but limited resource. There are types of land that always generate profits because their products always have a value higher than their costs, and there are types of land that only occasionally generate profits when demand suddenly increases. And there is a kind of land whose products almost never bring in rent. Because the selling price is just enough or not even enough to compensate for the effort. This classification reveals a truth. Rent is not a reward for effort but for luck of location and scarcity. The price of silver over the centuries is a clear testament to how external factors can shake up the entire distribution mechanism. As the silver mines of the Americas flooded Europe, the value of silver fell, causing inflation, prices of everything increased, and wage earners suffered the most because their incomes did not have time to adjust, while landowners benefited because rents increased with the prices of grain and agricultural products. Just a change in the flow of precious metals is enough to redistribute wealth among the classes. Likewise, advances in cultivation and trade transform the value of coarse cereal products. Essentials tend to get cheaper as agricultural productivity increases, while meat and milk become more expensive as grazing land shrinks as population and farming expand. Wood, once common, became rare as forests were destroyed. That change is not just economic, it touches the meals, homes, and daily lives of millions of people. When all the pieces fit together, the overall picture becomes clear. Division of labor increases productivity, exchange and money expand markets. The value of commodities revolves around labor and is divided into wages, profits, and rent. And finally the movement of silver, gold, land, and agricultural products shows that wealth is never static. It is always moving, always drawn towards the possessor of power and wealth. But it is in that movement that society progresses, sometimes unjustly, sometimes cruelly, but also the driving force that creates brilliant civilizations. Volume 2, The Nature, Accumulation, and Utilization of Capital in All Societies. When starting on the road to prosperity, it all depends on a silent but decisive factor. Capital is not just money or accumulated wealth but all means that can generate income in the future. From a plow in the field, a spinning machine in the factory to goods waiting to be exchanged at the market. It's all about capital, and capital more than anything else determines the speed and form of development of a country. But capital is not a homogeneous block. It divides into two distinct branches. Part of working capital is always moving, consumed and returned through exchange. That is the salary paid to workers, which is the raw material consumed in the production process, the goods displayed for sale and then quickly left the hands of the owner. The working capital operates like blood flowing continuously, feeding the economic body, and if it stops, the whole machine will be paralyzed. The remaining is fixed capital, the sustainable things that exist for a long time, not swallowed up in each production cycle, that is machinery, tools, factories, bridges and roads. Things once built or manufactured will serve for many years. Generations of fixed capital labor act as a skeleton, supporting the entire structure and making it possible for working capital to operate more efficiently. Both types of capital need to be allocated wisely. A small blacksmith in the village understood that too. If he puts all his money into buying ore and coal without investing in hammers, furnaces, and bellows, the work will be chaotic and productivity will be low. On the contrary, if he builds a really big furnace and buys a really heavy hammer but doesn't have enough raw materials to forge, the furnace will lie idle and become a burden. The balance between mobility and stability is a prerequisite for any career to stand firm. At the national level this is even more evident. A prosperous economy is one that puts fixed capital in the right place to increase long-term productivity. At the same time, maintain ample working capital so that production is never interrupted. Fixed capital expands capacity, working capital keeps operations running. They complement each other like two gears in a machine. But capital does not stop at production, a part of capital must always be in the form of money. Money does not directly generate profit like machines or land, but it is necessary for circulation and for the exchange of goods. Maintaining an adequate amount of money in society is like maintaining grease in a machine, otherwise the gears will jam, and too much will overflow and be wasted. Here arises a paradox: the more civilized the society, the less money people need compared to total capital. Because the credit system, valuable papers, and bills of exchange gradually replaced the role of gold and silver. Rich countries do not need to fill their treasuries with precious metals, they only need a small part in the form of money. The majority of capital is converted into tools, machines, and goods. A nation that holds too much gold and silver without putting it into production is like a farmer who stores rice in a barn without planting it. Seem rich but actually poor. From there, the story leads to a larger idea: capital accumulation. Capital does not arise from nothing, it is formed from the savings part of the product of labor, that is, the part that is not consumed but is stored to invest in further production. If a society spends everything, it will stagnate. Only when people, businesses, or the whole country accept to save a part of the results of labor will capital gradually grow and open the door to prosperity. However, not all labor creates capital. There are types of labor that, although useful, do not accumulate anything long-term. The builder builds a house, the remaining product increases fixed capital, but the artist performs a play. Or the waiter serves a meal, the job is over, no trace left in social capital. I therefore distinguish between productive and unproductive labor, not to devalue art or services, but to emphasize that only productive labor directly increases national capital. From here, society is faced with a choice of either letting the majority of labor fall into non-capital producing occupations, causing wealth to stagnate, or encouraging productive labor. Turn every drop of sweat into bricks for the building of prosperity, and the law of history has shown that every powerful nation must go through a stage of capital accumulation by expanding productive labor. But accumulated capital is not always used wisely. There are two ways for capital to come: one is the profitable way, the other is the wasteful way. When a merchant or manufacturer invests capital in goods, tools, or labor, they are giving capital to hands that create new products, expanding the potential for profit. That is how capital grows itself. On the contrary, when a rich person buries his capital in luxury, spending only for temporary satisfaction, that capital does not return to the production cycle, does not generate profit but disappears like smoke. This is the point of distinction between personal luxury and social luxury. Individuals may think that spending money on parties, on gold and jewelry is a sign of prosperity. But if the whole society does the same, the common capital is depleted. Without increased productivity, reform gradually dried up. A country gets rich not because people spend a lot but because they accumulate and invest capital in the right place. Accumulate capital. So always go with savings. And this saving is not simply austerity but a smart choice between today and tomorrow. When a farmer sets aside part of his seed rice to sow the next crop, it is a short-term sacrifice for a greater harvest. A country is the same, accepting to spend less, using the surplus to expand production, and then having more to consume later. However, capital accumulation would be meaningless without a protective legal order. People only save and dare to invest long-term when they believe that their achievements will not be taken away. In places where the law is unstable, the government is arbitrary, and there is war and looting, everyone tries to spend money quickly and hide their assets instead of spending money to build fixed capital and wealth. Therefore, it cannot flourish in chaos. It needs the foundation of security of faith in the law. Now if we look at the process of capital movement, we will see an important rule. Where capital is allocated determines the form of labor in society. When more capital is poured into agriculture, people will reclaim new fields, buy plows and harrows, and hire more farmers. Society became an agricultural society. As capital turned to commerce, factories sprang up, goods filled the ports, labor transformed, society inclined toward industry and capital exchange in that sense. Like a stream of water that leads the plants to grow wherever they go. Here arises a remarkable fact, that capital tends to seek out the place of highest profit. A trader will not invest money in a low-profit industry when another industry offers higher profits. And since everyone acts in this way, capital moves, disperses, and gradually becomes fairly evenly distributed among industries, and private interests lead to a middle order. It is the invisible hand that makes capital find its optimal path without any central command. But the move is not always smooth. There were barriers, heavy taxes, trade monopolies, and privileges for a small group. These barriers act like dams across the flow of capital, forcing it to flow in the wrong direction, causing waste and stagnation. When a government grants a company a monopoly on trade, the capital of many others is left out, unable to participate. As a result, society loses competitiveness, productivity falls, and average wealth declines. Furthermore, there are differences in how capital is used at different stages of development in a poor society, with most of the capital going to agriculture, where food is produced. The most basic needs are when society is richer, with surplus agricultural products, capital gradually shifts to industry and then commerce, and only when it reaches a high level of prosperity does capital pour into luxury industries that satisfy spiritual, artistic, and comfort needs. It is a natural progression that reflects the hierarchical expansion of human needs. It can be said that capital is the guiding light for social evolution. It led from the self-sufficient countryside to the bustling commercial city and then to large-scale industry. And that path, though long, is always based on a simple principle. Only those who know how to save and invest instead of squandering and spending can achieve prosperity. If we classify capital, we can see two main forms, fixed capital and working capital. Fixed capital is what continues to serve production through many cycles such as machines, tools, factories, livestock used for plowing. Working capital is the opposite, always moving, always having to be replaced after each production cycle such as raw materials and food to pay workers, goods on the trading route. This distinction is important because it determines the rhythm of the economy. Fixed capital creates lasting strength, but if too much capital is locked up there will not be enough working capital to pay wages, buy raw materials, and maintain production. On the contrary, if we only focus on mobility and forget about fixity, production will lose its foundation. There are no tools and facilities to increase productivity. The balance between two types of capital. So it is the rhythm of life of a nation. Imagine a craftsman, the hammer and anvil are fixed capital, the money to buy iron and steel to forge, the salary to pay the assistant. That is working capital. If the hammer breaks or the anvil is broken, he loses his foundation. Without iron and steel and men, he cannot make a product. Every society differs only in the scale of this coordination. From a small workshop to an entire industry, that principle remains unchanged. Okay, there is one particular type of capital that I always value more than anything else. Human knowledge and skills. A skilled worker, a good engineer, a wise doctor. They are the capital to live, the capital to walk, the capital to think. Without them, machines are just cold blocks of iron. Tools are just things. It is human capital that makes all other forms of capital work. That is why societies that invest in education, training, and research will eventually outstrip those that rely solely on resource exploitation and simple labor. At the national level, that capital operates in a complex structure, partly in the hands of farmers and landlords, tied to land, and partly in the hands of merchants. Associated with goods and circulation. Part of the production is in the hands of the manufacturers, attached to workshops and machinery, and above all there is also the capital of the tax state and the military treasury. Such capital does not directly create wealth, but it greatly influences how wealth is distributed and protects state policy. So, whether it be to make capital flow stronger or to choke it off, a government that encourages trade, protects property, and reduces taxes unreasonably will free up capital to find its way to profitable places. A government that monopolizes, corrupts, and plunders will cause capital to flee or lie dead in buried safes. We do not need many examples, we need only look at the cities that flourished because of free trade and the lands that were exhausted by exploitation to see the difference. Allocating capital across sectors is also not simple. Capital tends to seek out industries that offer high returns, but these returns vary over time. As more people pour into one industry, profits fall, and capital gradually moves to another industry. The process repeats itself, making the economy like a self-regulating machine, without anyone needing to give orders. Self-interest and desire are enough to steer the entire society along an orderly path. Finished. That order is sometimes distorted by artificial intervention. For example, when a government imposes high import tariffs to protect an industry that is forced to stay there despite low productivity. As a result, society has to consume poor quality goods at higher prices and the common capital is constrained. Meanwhile, if capital is left free, it will flow to where it can create the most wealth and the entire nation will benefit. It should also be added that capital is not only profitable in the present but also towards the future. When a merchant builds a ship, he knows the profits will not come immediately. But when the ship leaves port carrying goods across the sea, the wealth will return many times over. Capital always contains in it a belief, an expectation. The society where many people are willing to wait, that is, accept long-term investment instead of just looking for small immediate profits, that society will go far. Finally, let us remember that capital is not just a number on paper, it is the breath of millions of people. The farmer busily cheers at his husband, the craftsman hammers at his forge. The merchants work hard in the market. The captain risked his life to sail the waves. Capital is the invisible link between them, the red thread that connects individual workers into a large fabric of the economy. In the economy there is a relationship that few people notice but has profound influence. The relationship between profit, interest and wages. These three flows originate from the value created by labor but divide along different paths. Wages are the direct payment for labor. It must be sufficient for workers to sustain their lives and reproduce their working capacity. When the demand for labor increases, for example when an industry expands, wages also increase. Conversely, when there are too many people looking for work and few vacancies, wages fall. Sometimes it's just the bare minimum to survive. Interest is the reward for waiting. Lenders do not directly work, but they put aside their own consumption to give capital to others to use in return. They receive a portion of the profit called interest. The interest rate depends on two things: overall social benefit and transaction security. In stable societies with clear laws, interest rates are usually low because capital is easily mobilized. In unstable places, with wars and robberies, interest rates skyrocket because lenders demand compensation for risks. As for profit, it is what is left after paying wages and interest. It is the motive that makes merchants take risks, makes manufacturers expand their factories, makes traders cross the sea. Profits are not always uniform, some industries have higher profits. There are few profitable industries, and that difference is the compass for capital movement. Imagine a city where a new commodity appears, a spice, a precious metal, profits in that industry soar, capital pours in like water, warehouses are built, ships set sail. But after just a few years, as more people joined in, the goods became popular, and profits gradually decreased. At that time, the capital quietly withdrew to find another place, without anyone's orders. The invisible hand of self-interest has rearranged the game. What is interesting is that there is always tension between these three streams. If wages rise too high, profits are squeezed down, producers have less incentive to expand. If interest rates are too high, profits are too little, capital is not mobile, and if profits are concentrated in the hands of a small group, workers are poor, society is unstable, and finally capital will have difficulty surviving. Only when all three are balanced in a common rhythm can the economy move forward. But this balance is fragile. Many countries have seen wealth turn to ruin because of the loss of that rhythm. Where wages were forced down to miserable levels, the people revolted or fled. Production fizzles where interest rates are pushed too high by greed or insecurity. Commerce stops, ships no longer sail, and where profits are sucked up by the state or a monopoly, innovation disappears, and society withers. I often see a rule that when society is prosperous, wages are often high. Because of the high demand for labor, interest rates were also low at that time. Because of strong capital circulation, profits, although not too sudden, are stable and enough to encourage investment. On the contrary, during recession, wages are low, unemployment is widespread, and interest rates are high because everyone is afraid of risk. Profits remain only in the hands of the strong who know how to take advantage of the crisis. In fact, every developed country must learn to keep the rhythm of those three flows. There is no fixed formula, but there is always the principle of encouraging labor with fair wages, encouraging savings and investment with reasonable interest, and maintaining profits as a fair reward for risk and innovation. Any deviation would leave a lasting wound in the economy. From here, we clearly see the role of competition. Competition is the invisible balance that keeps wages, interest and profits within bounds. Where there is free competition, prices reflect scarcity, and profits make it difficult to monopolize for long. Where competition is stifled by monopoly or privilege, all three flows are distorted. Workers are underpaid, capital is locked up, and profits are illegally accumulated. It can be said that the whole economy is like a symphony. Labor is the background music, capital is the drumbeat, profit is the treble note. If any part is played out of tune, the whole piece becomes jarring. But when each flow is skillfully coordinated, we hear a magical harmony. The music of prosperity. Every profession in society, from agriculture, handicrafts to maritime trade, has its own specific profit margin. But what I've come to observe over the long term is that difference never lasts forever. Where profits are higher than normal, capital will pour in like a waterfall, and labor will also shift. Where profits are low, capital is withdrawn and workers leave, there is no need for anyone to command, nor for orders from above. That quiet shift re-established balance in small towns as a craft industry suddenly became a moneymaker. Such as weaving or shoemaking. We see that just a few years later, a series of new factories sprang up, the high profits at first gradually decreased and then stopped at the same level as other industries. People still get rich but not extraordinarily. That fairness in profits, over the long term, is an unbreakable rhythm. Having a power like water, it seeks out low places, enters crevices, and flows to the most beneficial place. So in free trade capital does not sleep, it moves from surplus to shortage, from low profit to high profit industry. Thanks to that, the whole economy is constantly moving. Wherever this flow is hindered by unreasonable taxes, monopolies, or privileges, there is stagnation, rich and poor are divided, and conflicts erupt. But the re-establishment of balance does not happen in an instant. It takes time, sometimes years, sometimes decades. During that time, many people enjoyed extraordinary profits, while many others suffered losses. Society is therefore always swinging like a pendulum, moving and looking for a foothold. It is this fluctuation that creates a vivid picture of economic life, where each individual pursues his own interests, but the whole draws a common rule. Especially in agriculture, profits often fluctuate strongly, land cannot be moved, so when an area has a bumper crop, agricultural prices fall, profits decrease, and farmers suffer. On the contrary, when the crop fails, prices skyrocket, some people benefit, others lose everything. Unlike industry or commerce, where capital is easily withdrawn and reinvested, agriculture ties people to the land. Take greater risks. This explains why for centuries the life of peasants was precarious, while it was easier for merchants and factory owners to create lasting wealth. Another interesting thing is that profits are often higher in dangerous or difficult professions, such as traders who sail long distances, merchants who carry goods to war zones, or miners who go underground. All receive greater rewards for greater risk and hardship. Capital not only pursues profit but also considers safety. Therefore, two industries have the same investment capital, but if one industry is less risky, the profit is also lower. It is also important to remember that profit margins reflect not only industry but also social conditions in stable wealthy countries. Profit margins are often lower not because traders are less talented, but because competition is fierce and capital is plentiful, leaving no room for large irregularities. On the contrary, in poor, backward, chaotic societies, profits are high but come with dangers. The profits can be huge. But one disaster can wipe it all out. From all those observations, I realize that wages and profits are not just numbers, they are a mirror of the health of the whole society. Looking at these three streams, we can know whether a country is prosperous or declining, peaceful or unstable. They are discreet but honest indicators, because no one can hide their true interests for long. The entire movement of the economy, from the wages of craftsmen to the profits of merchants to the interest rates on loan books, follows natural laws. They can be slowed, distorted but cannot be erased like a river. You can block it with dams, divert it with canals, but the water still flows into the sea, and the economy with its invisible hand will also flow according to its inherent law regardless of any barriers. Volume 3, Wealth Development is different in different countries. In the development process of every country, wealth does not appear simultaneously in all areas. It has a natural order like the seasons following one another. First of all, people are forced to return to the land, the most basic source of life, when their stomachs are still hungry. No one can think of luxuries from land, they look for seeds, livestock, crops. Then when the rice was full and the granaries were no longer in short supply, they began to pay attention to making tools, clothes, and more sophisticated things to serve life. Eventually, when both of these needs were stabilized, exchange expanded beyond village borders and commerce flourished. The natural order of wealth is like that: agriculture, industry, commerce, in any country. This should have been the natural path of prosperity, where wealth spread from fields to workshops and then to distant markets. Yet European history after the fall of the Roman Empire charted a completely different trajectory, a derailed path. After the fall of Rome, European lands fell into the hands of warlords. The holders of the territory possessed absolute power. And with that power, they set up a system that tied farmers to the land. The farmers are no longer the owners of the fields they sow, they became serfs, forced to serve, pay taxes, and were not allowed to leave their lands. If the natural order encouraged investment and improvement to make land more profitable, feudalism paralyzed this. Why should a serf bother to increase productivity when the end result does not belong to him? That explains why for centuries agriculture in Europe was hampered, and fertile land was exhausted. Farmers have no more motivation to improve. Meanwhile, the lords were only interested in power and war. They spent money on castles and soldiers to maintain their privileges, but not on the fields. The wealth that should have come from the land was stopped at the very gates, but history is not entirely immobile. Amid the heavy fields and the cramped countryside, cities began to stir to life. They started out humble. Usually small towns located along trade routes or river ports where ships could anchor. Merchants and traders realized that barter was another way to acquire wealth. If the land is blocked, the market opens up. Medieval cities rose up thanks to this. From the sparse markets, trading streets, and artisan guilds gradually formed, people linked together to protect their interests and expand trade. There, merchants and craftsmen found relative freedom compared to peasants bound to the fields. It is in these places that the fires of wealth are rekindled. Urban development has a double effect. It nurtures a new class. People who are not dependent on the lord but live by exchange and production. On the other hand, the wealth accumulated in the city returns to impact the countryside. Merchants need agricultural products to sell, craftsmen need raw materials to craft. Thus, gradually even closed territories had to open up so that land could be exploited more efficiently to meet the needs of the urban market. It is a reversal of the natural order. Instead of agriculture leading industry and commerce, in medieval Europe, urban commerce fueled the revival of agriculture. It was the city that liberated the countryside, not the countryside that nurtured the city, as is often the case. From here, a new relationship is formed where wealth is no longer the individual product of land but the resonance of land, workshop and market. The city not only swallows the benefits for itself but also brings the light of wealth back to the fields. Improve production, improve farmers' lives. That's the European way. Even though it deviates from the natural path, another path is found to enter the era of prosperity. In the centuries after the fall of Rome, Europe lived in the armor of territorial power. The land belongs to those who hold the sword, the law is the will of the strong. Farmers were forced to work in the fields, shouldering arbitrary work and payments. The finished product is torn apart by all sorts of obligations. From the day the Duke translated to Thursday bang rice and then fined for any reason. In such a situation, no one would be foolish enough to accumulate good farming tools, raise more livestock or try new breeds, since accumulation in the countryside was only fuel for the insatiable hunger of power. When property rights are fragile, all innovative ideas die on the plow, roads are deserted, merchants are rare, markets are sparse, and agricultural products are mostly consumed locally because there is no further market. Land taxes were collected in kind and labor, not in money, causing all transactions to freeze. A territory's prosperity or decline depends on the harvest and the heart of the whip-wielding man, not on fair exchange. In that order, the natural thing that should have happened first, that agriculture would have given way to industry and commerce, was blocked. Land is still the foundation but is treated as an asset to be flaunted, not a resource for development. Amidst that gray picture, another vein of life quietly grows. The walled towns and periodic markets were originally just shelters for traders from raiders and gradually transformed into communities with their own conventions. Privileges were granted in exchange for taxes and loyalty. The right to assembly, the right to association, the right to self-government, and the right to judge within the walls. These privileges, though sometimes narrow, were still better protections for property and occupation than anything else outside the realm of artisans who gathered together in guilds, fixed apprenticeship terms, initiation ceremonies, quality standards, merchants formed guilds, shared risks, and pooled capital for long journeys. This organization is not without its downsides, it sometimes closes the door to newcomers, maintaining scarcity to raise prices. But in a situation of disorder, it is precisely this professional discipline that allows skills to accumulate, capital to circulate, and contracts to be respected. The city thus became a rare place where wealth could grow without fear of arbitrary confiscation. When the security of wealth is assured, the habit of calculation replaces the habit of ostentation, accumulation replaces waste. The bustling market streets brought with them warehouses, factories, fixed wharves formed around the city walls, boat docks, warehouses, textile factories, blacksmiths, and dyeing kilns. From these nuclei, occupations differentiated, skills accumulated, and a new urban class grew up working with their hands. Without the sword and the badge, the city also did what the countryside could not do on its own, opening markets for agricultural products. Urban people needed food, furs, wood, wool, and linen to meet their needs. The closed territory was forced to sell out and gradually learned to sell more by producing better. When agricultural products have a place to sell, physical rent begins to be converted into money. Corrupt labor was redeemed by a fixed payment. Money entered the countryside not only as a medium of exchange but as a new measure of the relationship between landowner and farmer. Arbitrary obligations gradually gave way to real silver deals. The penetration of goods and cities also changed the tastes of landowners. They wanted fine textiles, fine wines, carvings and luxurious amenities to have them. They need money, not bags of flour or days' wages, in exchange for regular pay. They were willing to waive petty demands, rent fields to farmers for a fixed amount, and even encourage farmers to improve their crops so they could sell surpluses. Each advantage from the city market forced both sides to calculate more rationally, and it was these self-interest calculations that paved the way for more freedom in the countryside. The city also contributes to the repair of roads, bridges, and wharves. For the benefit of the merchants and craftsmen themselves. But those works almost immediately served farmers. Rice trucks travel further, wood from deep forests reaches market faster, and good seeds and farming tools reach farmers sooner. Every inch of road repaired is an inch of expanded market. Every inch of market expansion is a reason to sow more seeds and innovate farming methods. In urban areas, laws were written to settle disputes between people rather than to protect the dignity of a contractual, indebted class. Recorded, authenticated, enforced property. Rural areas are influenced by the rule of law through regular interactions with urban residents. When sales require paperwork, when rents are due, when disputes are brought into the judicial process, the arbitrary habits of territorial power naturally shrink, and the rule of law does not rain down. It spread like mist, thin as silk. And it is commerce that is the wind that pushes that bone away. The growth of the city also changed personal status. People who left the territory to make a living in Dan Town became free people according to local custom, a chance to change their status. Though not for everyone, it was still enough to create a social pull, the prospect of a steady salary, learning a trade, owning a stall or a small workshop made labor a new path of honor, alongside the old path of badges and land. Thus, if the natural order was upset by feudalism, history would have rebuilt the bridge in another direction. Commerce and crafts in the city filtered capital, reimplanted legal confidence, opened markets, changed tastes, and thereby revived agriculture. This winding path brings Europe back into line with the broader pattern, where safe markets are respected. People have the drive to accumulate and improve, where there is lasting wealth. In that long-term picture, it can be seen that the rise of the medieval city not only freed peasants from the yoke of corvée but also set a new pace of development for the whole society. As urban merchants sought stable supplies, as craftsmen demanded durable and cheap raw materials, they became the invisible allies of the peasants. This association, initially based solely on self-interest, gradually created a network of exchange whose power extended beyond the individual will of the lord or merchant guild. The countryside is no longer self-contained and the city cannot be separated from the fields. It is that need for exchange that forces economic relations to change. Landlords were only interested in the number of working days and the power shown in festivals and gatherings. But when they discovered that a fixed sum of money from the tenant could buy more luxuries, they began to loosen the feudal ties, gradually giving up their arbitrary claims. They became calculating landlords, and the peasants became innovative producers, each for his own benefit, unwittingly creating a form of economic freedom which no charter or decree had previously provided. This new freedom did not appear all at once, nor was it evenly distributed. In some areas, peasants escaped serfdom quite early, becoming independent tenants. In other regions, territorial power has remained tight for centuries, but the trend is clear. Urban commerce was gradually injected into the rural veins, a powerful medicine that forced the already stagnant feudal body to adapt or disintegrate. Landlords who stubbornly cling to the old form find themselves backward and less wealthy than those who know how to exploit the market to their advantage. At the same time, the city's growth created a new middle class. These were not old nobles, nor peasants, but craftsmen, merchants, and factory owners. They do not have badges to prove their status, but they have assets, professional knowledge, and a network of relationships. They became the moderating factor between the nobility and the peasantry, between political power and economic needs. From them arose demands for clear rules, for free exchange, for secure property rights, and each time these demands were met, the whole system took a step toward the modern order. Cities were also places of accumulation of knowledge, crafts and commerce which required calculation, recording, books and contracts. That creates the habit of remembering, comparing, and considering. Capital is the seed of new economic thinking. From counting each roll of cloth, each barrel of salt, each kilo of rice, people gradually learned to measure value, compare costs and profits. While the countryside still lived in the cycle of crops, the city entered the cycle of numbers, and that number, when spread to the fields, changed the way people farmed and traded. The end result is a reblending of urban and rural areas. At first they were like two opposing worlds, one burdened by feudalism, the other protected by walls and privileges. But over time, trade linked the two sides, with agricultural products feeding the towns, and crafts and working capital nourishing the countryside. This mutual dependence gradually replaced the old coercive relationship, replacing whips and orders. Now it is contract and market, instead of whim it is calculation, instead of street it is accumulation, from a broader perspective. This path shows that national wealth never progresses in a simple straight line somewhere. It can be volatile, it can be restrained, but once the fundamentals of asset security, market stability, and trading opportunities are established, the natural process finds its way back. It may be roundabout, it may be slow, but the flow cannot be stopped forever. And the revival of European agriculture from the Middle Ages is a living proof of that rule. The greatest result that this process has brought is a marked improvement in the way people used and exploited land in the past. When farmers were bound to corvée, they had no reason to tend their fields. Sow just enough to avoid punishment. Whatever the season. But when they were allowed to keep most of the produce, when their surplus income could be exchanged for urban goods, things changed. Every furrow becomes precious, every seed becomes hope, every harvest becomes an opportunity for wealth. At the same time, fallow land was reclaimed, better farming techniques were introduced, and competition among farmers increased productivity. Instead of being just a land of moderate production, the countryside began to reflect a new dynamic spirit. This is not just the story of individual farmers but the comprehensive transformation of society. The driving force does not come from a central government dictating but from the very link between urban needs and rural supply. This bond gradually shaped a new type of power, the aristocracy. Instead of relying on force and tradition, it must now learn to rely on economic interests to maintain its position. Wealth was no longer measured by the number of serfs or knights under one's command, but by the income one could use to consume luxury goods, to invest, to engage in business. Social status began to shake and a new order was quietly formed, the order of money, of contracts, of markets. This transmission is perhaps even more powerful than the battles because it takes place silently through every transaction, every coin that changes hands. In that context, farmers are no longer a passive class. When they saw that the surplus product could be sold, they gradually learned to negotiate. The market teaches them the value of their labor, teaches them the right to refuse or accept the conditions of renting land. Not everyone immediately becomes a free man. But every small step forward in the transaction deepens the sense of entitlement. Gradually, those small pieces joined together to form the big picture. Society moved away from serfdom, towards land rental and wage relations, the opposite influence from the city not only on goods or capital but also on spirit and streets. With the bustling pace of life, become an example for farmers to see new possibilities fair. Trade festival. Where their products are displayed alongside goods from all over. Ignite the desire for a life beyond the familiar narrowness. That aspiration, once kindled, cannot be extinguished by a few orders or a crackdown. It spreads, smolders, persists and gradually transforms both the economic and spiritual foundations of society. The relationship between town and countryside after the fall of the Roman Empire underwent a paradoxical process. Initially agriculture was weakened, farmers were oppressed, but the city itself, from being isolated and weak, became the factor that liberated and enriched the fields. From heavy dependence on feudal power, society moved to dependence on economic interests. A dependence that is also strict but opens the door to freedom and creativity. And it was that shift that prepared the foundation for the new era. Where wealth is no longer a privilege of blood but the result of effort and exchange. The transformation of agriculture in the Middle Ages was not only a period of escape from darkness but also a testament to the enduring power of natural laws in economic life. No matter how much oppression there is, no matter how much the ruling class tries to hold on to old interests, the exchange relationship between people, between urban and rural areas still finds a way to develop. Where there is a market, there is motivation, where there is relative security of property rights, there is accumulation. Each seed that is sown not only germinates into rice or barley plants, but also germinates into the habit of saving. Become patient investment for the future. What is remarkable is that this process did not take place according to any grand plan nor was it designed by the upper echelons of power. It is simply the result of countless individual actions. A farmer wants to keep the surplus for himself. A landlord wanted more money to spend. A merchant wants to make buying and selling easier. It is these seemingly selfish motives that combine to pave the way for a wealth that is more sustainable, broader, and more equitable than the old system. Economic freedom in its most basic sense is not a given but arises from the intersection of interests with a holistic view. It can be seen that the development of European agriculture after the fall of Rome was a long, bumpy but inevitable journey towards revival from the exhaustion of the fields under serfdom to gradual prosperity thanks to urbanization and then to the formation of land-rental relations and the primitive market economy. All are steps to prepare for the nation's wealth in the future. There is no such platform. 16th century trade, maritime exploration, and modern industrial advances would not have exploded so dramatically. From this, we learn a timeless lesson. Prosperity cannot be sustained apart from agriculture. Just as agriculture cannot develop without this two-sided trade. Seemingly opposite, they are actually two heartbeats of the same body. The weakening of one side sooner or later withers the other, but the recovery of one side can pull the whole system back up. It is a vicious and fair cycle that also demonstrates the unbreakable bond between human beings. Labor and land. Volume B, Political Economic Systems. It has long been known that the wealth of a nation is measured by the amount of gold and silver it holds in its treasury. The glittering light of precious metals captivated many kings and merchants. Many lawmakers blindly follow a principle of hoarding. From that belief, a system was born, the mercantilist system, where all policies were built with the sole purpose of making more gold and silver flow into the country than flow out. Goods to them are just means, commerce is just a way to bring back precious metals. In that system, exports were always praised, while imports were suspected, even scorned. It is argued that when goods are sold to foreigners, gold will flow in. Conversely, when buying foreign goods, gold will flow out. Thus, the entire trade policy is shaped to encourage exports and discourage imports. They erected tariff barriers, banned many goods, and granted privileges to trading monopolies. All just to make sure the balance is in their favor. But the truth is not that simple. Gold and silver by themselves cannot feed people, cannot make clothes, cannot build houses. The real reform of a nation lies in its productive and exchange capacities. When people can buy cheaper goods from outside, they save energy and capital to invest in other more productive industries. Yet the mercantilist system imposed countless barriers, causing society to waste energy maintaining inefficient activities simply to keep the gold around. Import restrictions not only increase the price of goods for consumers but also encourage industries that are not suited to the country's natural advantages. Agriculture was sacrificed to protect fledgling industries. Land and labor resources are diverted from their natural productive places. Instead, let free exchange lead to fair allocation. People use national interests to suppress the very forces that create prosperity. It doesn't stop there. Mercantilist policies also erected strange barriers against countries considered disadvantaged in the balance of trade. It is believed that if a country regularly trades in deficit with a certain country, that country will lose its gold and silver. Therefore, goods from these countries are heavily taxed or even banned. But they forgot that import is not a loss but an exchange. We receive the necessary goods and the other party receives the corresponding value in return. The balance they fear is actually just a phantom of the imagination. To cover up the distortions created by this system, all sorts of auxiliary mechanisms were invented, such as drawback, which is the refund of taxes on exports to encourage traders to sell abroad, and subsidies for certain types of goods to force them to be competitive in the international market. Such measures may sound reasonable in the short term, but in the long run they only add to the burden on the treasury and distort the incentives of traders. Instead of competing on quality and price, they chase subsidies seeking incentives from the state. Also in the spirit of mercantilist, countries signed many trade treaties, but in essence they were often just bargaining, granting each other privileges in some industries in exchange for protection in other industries. As a result, such agreements are rarely for the common good of the people but mainly to maintain the interests of a group of monopoly merchants and the state, which needs tax revenue. Ordinary people, the buyers and sellers in the market, rarely benefited from these treaties. Instead, they suffer higher prices and stifled opportunities. Nowhere, then, did the mercantilist system show its contradictions more clearly than in colonial policy. People considered colonies as machines to suck up gold and silver, as lands born only to serve the mother country. European nations fought over the seas, building empires. Do not hesitate to launch war. All of this was to control the flow of goods from far-flung colonial lands that were forced to export cheap raw materials, import goods from the motherland at high prices, and absolutely not be allowed to trade freely with other countries. The interests of the indigenous people are sacrificed to the calculations of power and profit. But the cost of maintaining the colonial system was enormous, with armies, navies, and constant wars. The amount of gold and silver flowing in is not enough to compensate for the blood and money shed. Meanwhile, the commercial benefits that the colonies brought were concentrated in the hands of a small group of monopolistic merchants. Entire nations must be sacrificed for the false wealth of a few privileged people. The so-called wealth of the empire actually impoverished the ordinary people in the motherland. If the mercantile system was an illusion, then the physiocratic agriculturalists made another mistake. They believe that only land generates real value. According to them, industrial and commercial products are just a transition. New value can only come from cultivating the land. From there, they built a system that considered agriculture as the sole source of wealth. It is true that land is important, but it cannot be considered as the only resource. Industrial and commercial workers. Through creativity and exchange, new values are created and life is enriched. The world constantly proves that a nation's wealth does not depend on the amount of gold and silver in its treasury, nor does it come only from land, but from the free circulation of goods, capital, and labor. When exchange is open, when people can buy and sell without restraint, when capital and talent are free to find their most productive uses, then true wealth will arise, not from fences, not from privileges, not from wars or colonies, but from freedom. Labor equity created lasting prosperity at the core of the mercantile system. The obsession with the trade balance has led to a series of seemingly reasonable but paradoxical policies. For example, tariffs on imports are intended to protect domestic industries from competition. But in reality, this policy distorts prices, making goods expensive for domestic consumers. A piece of cloth imported from Holland or a piece of wool from England, which would have been cheap and good, now costs 1.5 times as much. Just to maintain the illusion that we keep the gold in the country. People are forced to pay more. Meanwhile, national resources are concentrated in industries that have no natural advantages. A country with a climate favorable to agriculture was encouraged to expand inefficient handicrafts. Land resources are wasted. Distributed labor. What could have fed many people became a burden just to satisfy a prejudice. That importing is dangerous, and self-sufficiency is safe. Measures like drawbacks, tax refunds for exports are just technical patches. They give the impression that the merchants are benefiting, that they can sell their goods cheaper. But in fact it is the people's tax money being used to encourage a few traders. Similarly, export subsidies encourage people to produce more of certain goods, regardless of whether society really needs them or not. So the unnatural industries flourish just because the government injects more money. The whole mechanism is like a complex machine, where the gears are distorted and the final cost is always borne by the people. Meanwhile, the monopoly given to large trading companies such as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company turned international trade into a private playground for a small group. They had control over the entire supply chain, set prices, and even decided who was allowed to trade. As a result, many independent traders were driven out of the market. Consumers have to accept the prices set by these monopolies. Commerce. What should have been a free-flowing river has instead become a dammed river, where interests are concentrated in the hands of a few in power, and the policy of selective sanctions against countries considered to have trade deficits cannot be ignored. Heavy laws, severe prohibitions, all stem from the fear of losing gold and silver. But no country has ever really become rich by banning other people's goods. On the contrary, free exchange has always been the path to expanding markets, encouraging innovation, and ultimately enriching all. Prohibition, instead of retaining wealth, only impoverishes both sides. However, the most obvious point of the mercantilist system was in the colonies. Each colony was considered as its own warehouse, where the mother country takes control. For example, the American colonies were only allowed to sell tobacco, sugar, and cotton to the mother country. In return, they are forced to buy industrial goods from there at high prices. Harsh laws forced colonial merchants to follow prescribed routes, pay taxes to the mother country's customs, and absolutely not trade freely with other countries. If violated, goods will be confiscated and even ships burned. These policies not only weighed heavily on the colonial people but also forced the mother country to spend enormous amounts on navy and army to protect this monopoly. War with Spain, with the Netherlands, with France. How much blood and treasure was shed just to maintain a few sea routes and a few warehouses in distant lands. The harsh truth is that the costs of those wars far exceeded the profits that colonial trade brought. The so-called national interest actually only enriches monopolies and a small class of privileged merchants. While the entire population was burdened with debt, the growth of colonial trade was often used to justify the system. But few people calculate the real cost. If all barriers to the free flow of goods were removed, the benefits could be much greater without the need for war. In a world where all nations trade fairly, each person will seek the most efficient place of production, and from there the whole society will benefit. The mercantile system, on the contrary, only increased hatred, war, and injustice. Even looking at the results, it can be seen that gold and silver flowing into the national treasury does not make the people happier. Prices of essential goods remain high, and the lives of farmers and craftsmen remain precarious. While the aristocratic and merchant monopolies prospered thanks to rich political privileges. In that system there is not general prosperity but accumulation in the hands of a few. It is a picture that is shiny on the outside but rotten on the inside. Contrary to what this system promises. Practical experience shows that countries that allow trade to be free, and let their people choose their own occupations and investment directions, their prosperity is more widespread and sustainable. Prosperity comes not from hoarding gold and silver, but from letting human labor, capital, and talent flow where they can do the most good. The Physiocracy school of agriculture emerged as a reaction against the mercantile system, but it had its own limitations. They believed that land was the only source of real wealth. In their view, only agriculture creates value. Commerce and industry are merely distributive or transformative activities, not creation of new wealth. From that belief, they built an economic system that placed the entire focus on the land and the farmers. Photographers compare the production process to the flow of blood in the body. Land is the heart, and all other industries are just the blood vessels. If the heart stops beating, the whole body dies. Therefore, they asserted that economic policy must focus on nurturing and liberating agricultural productivity. In their eyes, the best tax is a direct tax on land rent because land rent reflects the value of the flow produced by land. This way of thinking contains a rational kernel. It emphasizes the fundamental role of agriculture in traditional societies. But it is this absolutism that has made the agricultural system narrow and one-sided. If we consider land as the sole source of wealth, we will ignore the infinite creativity of manual labor, of commerce, of technology. A loom could multiply productivity, a new trade route could expand markets and enrich both sides. Shouldn't these things produce wealth? Fissures criticized the mercantilists for tying national interests to gold and silver, but they themselves fell into another form of rigidity. They view all non-agricultural activities as simply non-productive to their system, thus becoming a new rut that still constrains development and a single conceptual framework. Finished. What is remarkable about this school is the spirit of respect for nature and freedom of labor. They believe that the government should not interfere too deeply and should not impose arbitrary orders on production. Let things take their natural course. That is one of their basic principles. Although they overemphasized the role of the land, their emphasis on liberty was a major advance over the mercantile system. Capital is burdened with tariffs, monopolies, and constraints. When comparing the two systems of mercantilism and agriculture, we see that both carry within them pieces of truth but also full of limitations. Mercantilism saw the power of trade but turned it into a tool for the accumulation of gold and silver. Distort the market with barriers. Fissures saw the power of land but denied the value of industrial and commercial labor. What is needed is not to choose a side but to realize that wealth does not arise from just one source: land, labor, industry, and commerce. All can create value if placed in a free environment where people are allowed to pursue their interests without being bound by prejudice or privilege. It is from here that a new perspective emerges that society reaches its greatest prosperity not when it is closed within a rigid system but when it opens up to every profession, every idea, every person the opportunity to freely develop and see the difference clearly. Imagine a mercantile nation like a warehouse where gold and silver are locked up in vaults, closely guarded but yielding no profit. A Phi-Siazat country is like a field where crops are grown but there is no market to exchange, no workshop to turn rice into cloth, iron into tools. Neither can create comprehensive prosperity. Only when both warehouse and field, both market and workshop are connected in a free flow. Then wealth truly spreads. The principle of economic freedom, where trade is not confined, where production is not restricted, and where general prosperity becomes the natural result of that free order. Volume 5, National or State Revenue. For centuries, European nations have been guided by the seemingly self-evident doctrine that national wealth was measured by the amount of gold and silver held in the eyes of mercantile politicians. Gold and silver are the lifeblood of an economy, the sole measure of power and prosperity. From that belief, they built a whole system of policies of tariff barriers, import restrictions, export incentives, and tight control of currency flows. All to keep precious metals in the country. This story is not of a single dynasty or king but of an entire continent. From the bustling ports of Lisbon, Dam, London to inland cities constrained by prohibition. The shadow of mercantilism is cast over every cargo, every cabin train. Trade is no longer a free exchange but a battle for a favorable balance of trade. Exporting more than importing becomes the ultimate goal, regardless of the real needs of the people. The merchants saw gold and silver flowing out of the borders and thought it was blood draining from the nation's body. They believe that every imported coin is a loss. Every freight train that leaves is a part of the soul sucked dry. So they put all their efforts into protecting the positive trade balance like a solid wall to stop the blood from flowing out. From that belief arise countless consequences. Countries encourage exports by awarding subsidies or trade monopolies to certain companies. At the same time, they erected heavy tariff barriers, prohibiting the import of goods, competing with domestic production and trade. Instead of being seen as a mutually beneficial exchange, it was turned into a contest in which one country's victory is another's defeat. Try to imagine a scene. A small coastal merchant was forced to sell only to the East India Company, which had a state monopoly. A farmer wanted to buy cheaper cloth from a neighboring country but was blocked by high import duties. Ships leaving port no longer carried only goods but also the policies and ambitions of the court. In that picture, the prosperity of the people is pushed behind the curtain of precious metals, which the people really need. Food, cheap and good consumer goods, were sacrificed for an illusory goal, the hoarding of gold and silver, the mercantile system. In fact, it does not enrich the country in the sense of a prosperous life, but only makes the coffers of the government and a few privileged merchants. But that system has existed for a long time because it directly serves state power. War needs gold, the court needs money to feed the army and build the governing apparatus. In that logic, mercantilist policy became an effective political tool to both plunder the treasury and the treasury. Just granted privileges to bribe the merchant class. The interests of the majority are subordinated to the interests of the minority. The appeal of this theory lies in its simplicity and ease of understanding. If gold is wealth, keep gold at all costs. But the economic truth is much more complicated. Gold and silver are only a medium of exchange, not a source of wealth. Real wealth lies in the ability to produce in labor and creativity. A country may be rich but poor if its farmers are oppressed. Craftsmen were not free and trade was stifled. Does wealth really lie in the amount of gold and silver accumulated or in the abundance and freedom of the people? This question is the starting point to break the illusion that has bound Europe for centuries. When a nation pursues trade as a battle, trade policy becomes more than just tariffs or bans. It became an open battlefield where nations competed for colonies, control of seas, plundered ships and built huge fleets from Lisbon to London, from Madrid to Paris. Every government believes that expanding overseas territories is the only way to maintain wealth. The colonies in the Americas. Africa and Asia were not only new lands but also reserves of gold, silver, and rare products. The mercantilist system made colonial exploitation an indispensable tool. The countries did not allow the colonies to freely exchange but forced them to trade only with the mother country. According to the prices and conditions imposed, the colony was turned into a private warehouse. A locked market where natives are not free to decide their lives and products. The sight of ships carrying sugar, tobacco, cotton, spices, and precious metals leaving colonial ports and arriving at European cities became a symbol of the era. But behind the prosperity of those ports was poverty, oppression, and slavery. Millions of slaves were brought from Africa to the New World to work on plantations. Their blood and sweat turned into wealth for the motherland in mercantilist logic. People are just tools to accumulate gold and silver. The constraints of this system were not limited to colonies within Europe. Trade regulations tie down industries. Many companies are given monopolies not because they are better, but because they are closer to the government. A trader who wants to expand must ask for permission, pay a bribe, or be excluded from the game. Free competition is stifled, innovation is hindered. The interests of the majority of merchants and craftsmen were placed under the shadow of the privileged big man. In addition, the mercantilist system created a kind of perpetual economic war. Each nation sees its neighbor's prosperity as a threat. They fear that imports from other countries will deplete domestic gold and silver. Therefore, trade agreements are only signed when there is a guarantee that one side benefits more. Cooperation between nations, instead of being based on common interests, is viewed through the prism of suspicion and competition. In that context, war became an inevitable consequence. When a country feels its balance of trade is threatened, it does not hesitate to use cannons to regain the advantage. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a series of trade wars between England and the Netherlands, between France and England, between Spain and most of Europe. It all revolved around who controlled maritime trade and colonies. Remarkably, the government sees these wars as justified. For if wealth means hoarding gold and silver, then preventing goods and resources from flowing into the hands of opponents becomes a political goal. War in mercantilist logic is not a failure but a means to protect false prosperity. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Many countries, after a series of wars and huge expenditures to maintain the fleet, fell into a state of exhaustion. The gold and silver stored in the warehouses was not enough to compensate for the wear and tear of the people's lives. Taxes are getting heavier and discontent is growing. People realize that instead of bringing prosperity, the mercantilist system only created a vicious cycle. Forced exports, strangled imports, exhausted colonies, and constant warfare. A country can be filled with gold and silver but its people can still be poor. Wealth measured in precious metals does not correspond to actual affluence. This poses a major challenge. If the mercantilist system did not really bring wealth, was there another system that was more reasonable and sustainable? People are used to thinking of trade as a zero-sum game. One country wins, the other loses. But that logic contradicts reality. When a European merchant brought his goods to Asia or America, he did not force others to buy them. Both sides see benefits in the exchange. So why would a country consider the importation of its own people a threat? In fact, by importing things that it cannot produce, a country is saving effort and opening up opportunities for domestic workers to focus on what they are best at. The prosperity of a nation does not lie in how many gold bars it has accumulated, but in the production and exchange capacity of its people. If each person were free to engage in the trade in which he had an advantage, abundant production would arise, natural exchange would increase, and wealth would spread widely. So restricting imports and forcing exports is just self-inflicted and self-impoverishing. But the mercantilist system was not only wrong in theory, it was also dangerous in that it fostered vested interests. Commercial groups that have the privilege of controlling a commodity or a sea route will find every way to maintain their monopoly policy. Regardless of the loss to the majority, the government, instead of protecting the common interest, is drawn into serving the interests of a small group. This distorts the entire economy, enriching the few and leaving the vast majority in disrepute. However, to see clearly the limits of the mercantilist system, it is also necessary to compare it with another doctrine that appeared and caused a strong resonance. French agricultural theory, also known as physiocracy. They believed that only land and agriculture produced pure product, that is, value exceeding cost. Industry and commerce merely redistribute. According to them, a country is only truly rich if its agriculture flourishes. This theory sounds convincing because it is true that land is the source of all food and resources. But if you look closely, it is also a narrowing that is no different from a serious injury. It despises industry and commerce, while these very activities contribute significantly to creating new value. Mercantilism sanctifies commerce. Physiocracy sanctified agriculture. Both fall into the trap of monopolization, singling out one area and seeing it as the sole source of wealth. In fact, the wealth of a nation comes from labor in general, from the coordination of all branches of labor, from production to exchange, from industry to agriculture. Only when all are free to operate, unfettered by distorted policies, can society achieve true prosperity. Imagine a fertile field with no roads to transport the produce to market or a workshop full of goods. But both were banned from export for fear of losing gold, leading to poverty. Despite abundant capital resources. That is the waste that monotheistic theories can never solve. Furthermore, physiocracy falls into another error. They overbelieve that natural law will automatically create economic order. If agriculture is given priority. But in reality, if society only focuses on land, it will miss out on technical advances, industrial inventions, and commercial opportunities that bring common prosperity. Thus, both physiocracy and mortality suffer from the same limitation. One-sided view, one side is obsessed with gold and silver treasures, the other side is fascinated by green fields. Real wealth does not lie in a hoard of gold. It is not only in the fields but in the labor capacity, creativity, and freedom of exchange of people in all fields. For centuries, European nations relied on an inherent belief that economic power meant coffers filled with gold and silver. That is why tariffs and trade barriers were created like walls to block the flow of goods. People imposed heavy taxes on imported goods to both limit consumption of foreign goods and encourage domestic production. But in reality it is merely a distortion of the natural course of commerce, like deliberately bending a river to overflow and flood innocent lands. Imagine a craftsman in England. He wanted to buy cheaper raw materials from another country to lower the cost of his products, but the tariffs forced him to buy expensive raw materials domestically. As a result, your products are less competitive, your market is narrowed, your labor is wasted. Who benefits from that? Only a small group of domestic monopolies are protected by the policy, while society as a whole loses more than it gains. Free trade, on the contrary, it is like opening the doors wide open. When one country buys cheaper goods from another, both sides save labor, increasing welfare. Every person, every family, every business benefits from the abundance of products and from reasonable prices. Free trade is not a zero-sum game, but a win-win relationship. Where prosperity is multiplied, not divided. But proponents of the mercantilist system often give a reason. If we do not restrict imports, the domestic infant industry will be strangled. It is partly true that some industries initially needed protection. But the problem is that such protection often lasts indefinitely. Once businesses were used to living under the protection of the government, they will no longer have the motivation to innovate. They turn into spoiled children who only know how to rely on privilege. While society has to bear higher costs and accept stagnation. Some also worry that if trade is opened, the country will become dependent on foreign countries. But ask yourself, should an individual produce everything he needs from clothes, food to utensils just to avoid depending on others? Are you sure? He exchanges, and it is the exchange that makes him live better. The same is true for countries. The more open they are to exchange, the less likely they are to experience a crisis. Because when one supply is disrupted, others will take its place. Tariffs and trade restrictions are nothing more than a coercion, forcing people to consume more expensive, lower-quality products that only serve a small group. Meanwhile, free trade puts the interests of the whole society first, allowing each individual to seek their own interests and thereby create common interests. More broadly, mercantilist policies have left a profound mark on European history. Trade wars, exploited colonies, violent struggles for markets. It all stems from the belief that wealth must be measured by hoarded gold and silver. That trade is a clear race, but reality proves otherwise. Sustainable prosperity can only be built on the foundation of freedom, cooperation, and the division of labor. Thank you for making it all the way to the last pages of Web of Nations. This is not only an economics book but also a mirror reflecting the way people have been through the centuries. Searching for the meaning of work, of exchange, of freedom and of justice in a community larger than oneself. If you have listened patiently, perhaps questions and concerns have arisen in you that are not easy to answer right away. But they are the most precious rewards a work like this can give. I look forward to hearing from you. What did this book suggest to you that made you agree, disagree, or doubt? Please leave a review or comment. Because each new perspective and approach is a complementary piece to the common picture of knowledge that we are building together. And if you have another book in mind, one you're dying to hear retold, examined, and analyzed, please suggest it. It is your curiosity and need that will guide your next journey. Knowledge never stops. It expands through the questions that are constantly asked. Once again, thank you for listening till the end. And now goodbye and see you again.